Oh boy! You know what games everyone loves? Zelda. Or at least they say they do. You know what games everyone hates? Zelda. And you know what I think? I think I really love Zelda, but not for entirely respectable reasons.
I mean, when talking about this series, there's a lot of factors to consider. Since all the games are so similar, shut up, they are, most of the differences lie in the subtleties.
And I wanted to talk about it and throw this shit out there, partly because my favorite games are Zelda games, and partly because I want to launch this channel on a big topic, and partly because I keep hearing people talking about Zelda like this.
Because there's one thing about this game that I don't like about Ocarina, and is that in this game, there's treasure in every temple, but it's not like it's not always something that you have to use in the boss.
I don't see why that's a bad thing.
Oh, there's stuff in this temple that looks like you need to use an arrow. Maybe I'll get an arrow. In some of the temples in here,
Well, that's because these temples aren't anything at all.
you don't even get a weapon. Sometimes you get a fucking like armor or something, or you get like something that helps you advance in another part of the game.
This game's more like an arcade game. The reason it doesn't have that stuff is because it just doesn't have that stuff.
Just like bad jumps and.
Yo, Egoraptor, I love you, but hearing you talk about Ocarina of Time makes me want to pull my balls out of my gooch. I think what you guys are trying to say is that Ocarina of Time is more of an overcomplicated aesthetic experience and less of a fast, actiony game of mechanical mastery. And that's actually a really good observation and points out a very fundamental difference in the way we thought of games during the beginning and end of the 90s. Actually, if we're going to analyze the difference between these two games, let's start there.
Historical context.
Zelda games are rooted in very sacred, tried-and-true storytelling tropes that are culturally familiar to the Western audience. Just look at the overarching themes that make up the stories of these old games. You've got a high fantasy medieval setting, there's a princess in the castle, a sword in the stone, an evil wizard, a lone hero. After Nintendo's overseas success with Mario and the NES, they needed a new, maybe less weird series that they could sell to the larger Western audience. So they chose to deliver an endearing Japanese version of mythic European archetypes that were rife movie material in America. In fact, now that I'm looking at it, Link looks an awful lot like these other guys.
By the time of the Super Nintendo, games had stories and stuff, and for Zelda, Nintendo decided to write in the old Joseph Campbell hero's journey. And both of the games follow it to a T, Ocarina especially so.
Sheltered young white male is called to adventure, has the opportunity to refuse, passes some visible threshold to the outside world, completes a checklist of tests, teams up with some supernatural sidekick, gets some big reward, and just when things seem that they're at their worst, he gets an unexpected boost, and is finally able to confront the ultimate evil. Zelda is chock full of symbols and characters that are part of our collective unconsciousness. These archetypes and tropes work so well because they're a part of our culture, rooted in the myths that form the most basic foundations to our stories.
This setup turned the early Zelda games into a flexible outlet for medieval-themed Nintendo adventure games. They had a lot of easy story and visual material to work with, but a blank slate of game design material. Back then, there wasn't a real obvious sense of continuity or ongoing drama between these games, and Ocarina of Time arguably stands on its own as a pretty obvious reboot of Link to the Past.
And though both games follow a very similar story, the generational shift between the two is where the real physical differences between them lie.
Physical interactivity.
The first 10 years or so of Zelda produce games that are artifacts of trends that were popular during their time. They're very refined and well-designed artifacts, but when replaying them, it's pretty easy to get a feel for what gaming was like at the time. Look at Zelda 1's oblique 80s gameplay. The rock-hard difficulty and clandestine puzzles were designed to encourage social interaction outside of the game, mainly by prodding word-of-mouth tip-swapping with the kids who read through the latest Nintendo power. Link to the Past is more accessible, but no less difficult. But look at those big watery anime eyes, and those pages of lore text you have to scroll through. Some of these sprites look like they're straight out of a JRPG, but the combat sure isn't. Jesus, look at all the bullets! Ocarina of Time leapt on the scene during a 3D revolution where technical spectacle was just as thrilling as actual game design. Navigating and looking around a 3D space was a puzzle in and of itself, and combat was more of an afterthought this time. And you know, that's kind of the same priorities that a lot of other early 3D adventures had. The technical shift between 2D and 3D games changed everything. It changed the way games looked and felt, it changed the controllers, the marketing, the budgeting. Games in 1998 hardly resembled games from just 4 years earlier. Going from 2D to 3D wasn't just a graphical improvement, it fundamentally changed the way you played games. A paradigm shift of this magnitude hasn't really happened since. For once, game marketers could say something like,
"Everything you know is about to change."
and actually mean it. It was scary and awkward, a lot of the old techniques didn't work anymore, and there wasn't a big library of other examples to fall back on for ideas. For Zelda, Nintendo decided to play it safe and reboot the old game over again in 3D. Though the title and visuals may be different, both games follow an extremely similar formula. You meet the actual damsel in distress princess fairly early on. After going through 3 dungeons and 3 boss battles, you get the Master Sword, and something terrible happens that unlocks a dual world mechanic. You go clear out a good deal more dungeons and get a lot of the same stuff. Both games combine RPG, action, and adventure game elements onto an overhead view protagonist who spends a lot of time walking across a green background. But something else happened when they switched from 2D to 3D. That depth was also added to the game's world and writing. Ocarina of Time is more about building a virtual world and establishing a sense of place than its predecessor, and the whole game has a good deal more interesting little details. Take this guy for example. He's absolutely furious at you because in the past you taught him how to drain the well and unleash a horrible monster on the town, and that gives you your actual clue to travel back in time and do the stuff he's so mad at you for. Or this guy, for example, this angsty emo kid who's strangely related to almost everyone else in town. You later find him whining a path to his death in the Lost Woods after everyone else gives up on him. Or this guy who buys and sells the living manifestations of undead ghosts. He jokes about prostitution and can read your mind and is probably the same guard who was in here 7 years ago. Hell, even the nameless extras like the goddamn chicken lady is more memorable for some inexplicable reason.
Maybe it's the eyes.
Games just got character, you know?
In Ocarina of Time, the sages that you rescue out of later game dungeons are actually major story characters who you develop relationships with hours earlier, unlike the anonymous maidens in Link to the Past. You spend a lot of time in between dungeons, setting up your pathway to the next dungeon, and frankly, this is where all the most memorable stuff happens.
The build-up to the Dark World is the only real memorable set-piece event of Link to the Past that I could easily recall. Other than that, well, you got this guy who lives under the bridge and gives you a bottle. Seems like they could have done something with him. And, then you got this guy who's totally just an average middle-aged man until he turns into a master lockpick later. Thing is, he has more of an arc than almost every other living thing in this game. Why do these people in places lack depth? Why are they ignored by the narrative, and why do they feel more like accessories to the gameplay? Maybe it's because SNES games aren't as much about telling stories and building worlds as much as they're about nimbly dodging a screen full of hazards. But that's another thing. The sense of movement and control in Link to the Past isn't as honed as its successor either. There's this thing in game design called shared circuits, or game feel or something. Actually, this thing doesn't really have an official textbook vocab word to describe itself because it's such an intangible concept. Steve Swink called it game feel. Gregerson and Grodel called it
Motor isomorphism.
the pursuit of fidelity between bodily and virtual movements. Christopher Franklin called it kinesthetics. Go watch his video about it, he's way smarter than me. Actually, what I'm trying to say is that the very basic act of moving around and slashing stuff is less satisfying in Link to the Past than it is in Ocarina. The entire combination of sounds, animations, and programming wizardry that makes interfacing with the controller got better in Ocarina. Just listen to that sword. That crispy metallic shink is actually a pretty intimidating sound. Let's compare. And just listen to those footsteps. Every single one of them feels crisp and weighty. Link stops on a dime and moves at a speed that's dependent on how hard you're pushing the thing that makes him move. It doesn't feel like there's a middleman between the screen and your controller. Compare it to the walk cycle in Link to the Past, where Link's feet are sprinting at a speed faster than he's moving.
It's like he's covered in grease.
It's amazing how something so subtle can change the feel of the entire game. It looks subconsciously off, and it feels imprecise. It lacks friction. When you hear someone complain about floaty controls, this is what they're talking about. Also, why is his hair pink? The recoil you get from a hit is ridiculous. It sends you flying near across the room and locks you out of control. Mid-game enemies hit for shitloads of damage, though you wouldn't know it by looking at them, and you barely have any time to recover. Since there's no real collision detection between Link's sprite and theirs, they can pin you down in a corner and siphon away hearts much quicker than they can elsewhere. That's not to say that Ocarina of Time doesn't have a slew of bad design decisions too.
But in general, they're both pretty similar, and despite their flaws, they're both really good games, which makes this a really long and difficult discussion. But I'm not done yet. There's one other dimension of their design I still want to get into.
Concluded in part 2.